Hello everyone, my name is Alexia, and today I'm going to be talking you through how to achieve the best marks that you possibly can on a literature exam or any sort of paper that you need to write during your academic career. The thing is, this video is not specific to any exam board or to any specific exam paper, simply because the skills that I'm going to be talking you through can be used in literally anything, obviously within literature. So I feel like it wasn't worth doing something that was specific to a type of exam, because then it could benefit everyone instead of it being just focused to the people that take that particular exam that I chose to focus on. The good thing about literature is that there is no right or wrong answer. So when you get like a math paper or science paper, you have this mark scheme that has specific words or specific ideas that you need to include in order for you to be able to get the mark. It's quite objective. Within literature, it's completely subjective to the examiner that you get, and within literature, your mark schemes include words like sustained analysis, excellent knowledge, things that are more demonstrated throughout an essay rather than something that is explicitly there. So there isn't something in a mark scheme that will say needs to mention metaphor blank in order to get marks. That's not really how it works. So the good thing as students is that your primary focus is learning the literary skills that it takes in order to analyze a piece of text, and then just simply being able to apply that to any text that they kind of throw your way within an exam. So the more you practice analyzing something, the better you're going to get at it, and that's literally all that you're going to need to do in order to prepare for your exam or in order to prepare for any sort of essay writing that you need to do. This video is split into 3 different parts. So first we're going to talk about structure, then we're going to talk about analyzing prose, and then we're going to talk about analyzing poetry. The way that you structure your answer within an exam or within an essay that you're writing is extremely important, because it demonstrates to the examiner that you know exactly what you're talking about and that you are developing your points thoroughly. And that's where you need to demonstrate within your answers in order to be able to get those high marks within literature. So the structure of your essay is really, really important. And a lot of the times within any sort of literary mark scheme, you are going to get a band that is specific to the structure that you use within your essay. So it's worth memorizing the little acronym that I'm about to run over in order for you to be able to attain those really high marks. Because structure is just something that's really easy, because that one you can already know beforehand. Before you walk into an exam hall, you already know the exact structure that you're going to use within your essay, and then you already secure yourself those marks, which is really good if your analysis is lacking because you find the poem or the prose that they give to you a little bit more challenging than what you're used to. So the structure that I would recommend using is the acronym PETAL. You're going to have your point in which you're going to state exactly where your paragraph is going, or exactly where you're aiming to do within the next couple of lines. And it's really important that you make that quite clear, because then you're signaling to the examiner that your structure is very good and that you know exactly how you should build an essay. Then you're going to move on to mention your evidence. Now your evidence is where you're going to put in the quotes that you're going to be analyzing throughout your paragraph. But something that's really important is that you need to make sure that you embed your quotations. So what does that mean? Embedding your quotes means that instead of stating, for example, blah, 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 you do something that sounds like this. The sensation of water flowing over my body, which struck me how much the walls of my prison had closed in on me, showcase how Meursault fantasized about the outside world. So you see how instead of stating, for example, and then giving the entire quote, I actually embedded it into a phrase that made sense within my essay. This just overall makes your structure much more clear, and it makes it a more cohesive piece of writing in order for your examiner to read. So it displays some higher level skills that is obviously what you need to showcase in order to attain those higher bands. But please don't worry if you can't seem to do that within an exam, because I know that the time limit makes you panic and then you can't think straight. But it's a nice thing to do in order to make sure that everything that you're doing is coherent. So next we're going to move on to your technique. Your technique is where you state exactly what the technique that's being used in the phrase. Is it a metaphor? Is it a simile? Is it using personification, imagery? Whatever it is, you state it. And then you also need to make sure that you state its effect. So the simile creates, the personification allows for something along those lines. Then you want to mention your analysis. And now your analysis is where I don't know, I feel like every English teacher says this, is the why and the why and the why and the why. It's really where you're going to build your analytical points and where you're going to make sure that you're getting all of those like really, really high marks. It's within your analysis, and I'm going to talk through how to do that in a second. One thing that I would recommend is that if you are mentioning specific words, that before you mention that word, you mention the word class, because that is also something that's going to make sure that you're getting those higher marks, because it's something that not all students think of doing, but it just portrays to the examiner that you know exactly what you're talking about. So let's say you are analyzing the word running. So you, instead of saying running, you could say the verb running, and then you're mentioning that word class, and it again signals to the examiner that you know exactly what you're talking about. And then last but not least, we're going to get your link. Now your link is where you're going to mention the main point of your paragraph again, so you rephrase the start, but it's also where you're going to link that paragraph to your greater thesis or to a greater link within the prose or poetry that you're reading, and it's really going to showcase that you can analyze something very close, but you can also analyze it in a broader sense and showcase how it helps to build an underlying theme or an underlying argument within the piece of work that you're analyzing. So now we're going to move on to analysis of prose. So what is prose? Prose are things like autobiographies, novellas, any sort of book, plays, just more of like your everyday piece of literature. When you're analyzing something, you want to make sure that you're following this train of thought, because then you're really making sure that you're developing that analysis, which is exactly what examiners need to see in order to be able to give you that top band. So you need to first identify your technique. Then you need to think to yourself, why is that technique there? Why is that important? After you've identified why that technique is being used, then you need to consider the effect of that technique. And after you've done that, then you need to consider, why is that effect important? So why was that technique used in specific to create that tone, that atmosphere, and why is that important? And then last but not least, you need to think about the overall effect on the reader, which is yourself. And the reason why that's important is because it's making sure that you're thoroughly developing everything that you're saying within your essay. There's nothing worse than including 300 quotes within one single essay and not developing any of them. That is not what your examiners want to see, and if you want to achieve those higher bands, then you need to make sure that every single quote that you put in place, you've followed this train of thought so that you've analyzed all of them thoroughly. In literature, quality over quantity is super, super important. You need to make sure that the quotes that you're picking are the most effective and also thoroughly analyzed within your essay. Otherwise, there's no way that you're going to reach the top band. So what techniques can you actually identify? There's little to no point in me going over what each technique actually is. You can just simply Google the words if you don't know what I'm talking about. However, I feel like it's important for you to have a base and a foundation for what each technique sort of does, and then you can use that accordingly. Because when you're running out of time, and you simply glance over and you see a metaphor, or you see a simile, or you see a personification, if you have a general understanding of the text and a good foundation of what that technique primarily aims to do, then you can just figure out an analysis really quickly, and that's going to save you loads of time within an exam. When you have more time to think about your essay, then I wouldn't necessarily rely on the things that I'm about to say. I would say create your own interpretation of what you think the effect is. But when you have that time limit, that's when the foundation of what techniques generally aim to do is really, really important. So metaphors and similes, they emphasize comparisons, or they create an image within the reader's head. The effects of these are completely subjective to the type of image that's being created. Is it scary? Is it nice? Is it pleasant? Entirely up to what the writer is attempting to do and what you interpret from the image that you visualize in your head when you read it. Within similes and metaphors, I would highly, highly recommend that you analyze connotations of specific words. So if you have a metaphor that mentions the color red, for example, pick up on that word and talk about why red was used instead of blue, green, purple. Next, we've got your personification. Personification is commonly used to bring life into a scene or a specific image that's attempting to be portrayed. And you need to think to yourself specifically, why is that important? So why is that image so important, or why are the clouds dancing? So it's also, again, important to pick up on the connotations. What are the connotations of the verbs that are being used in order to personify that specific thing? And you can even start to think to yourself, are they contrasting? So if you had like a thunderstorm, for example, and you describe the clouds as dancing clouds, does that contrast the fact that a thunderstorm is really scary? Does that have an overall meaning? Is the thunderstorm supposed to be pleasant instead of a scary experience to the speaker? So that's where you really need to pick up on the connotations of each of the specific words and why they are important in creating the overall effect that the writer is aiming for. Next, we've got your symbolism. Your symbolism is most commonly used when an idea needs to be emphasized, or when an overall arcing theme needs to be showcased. So your job is to identify that theme or what the symbol could mean in a higher sense, and mention that within your analysis when you're trying to depict why that symbolism is there. Then you've got your pathetic fallacy, which is used to reflect a mood or a tone, and again, your job is simply to state why that it's important or what that means for you as a reader. Irony can be used to emphasize a frustration or discomfort within a particular scene, but it's also interesting to consider irony in respect to characters. So which character is using the ironic expression? Is it a character that does that all the time? Is that important in the way in which they are constructed? Or is that just a one-time thing? And if it is a one-time thing, why was it chosen in that particular point of the play, book, whatever? So now we're going to move on to talking about more constructive elements that you can pick up on. The first thing I'd recommend is that if you're ever studying a text that has a set structure, so for example, your Greek tragedies, then please make sure that you learn the conventions of that particular text, because that's where your marks are going to come into your essay. So if you are studying something like a Greek tragedy, make sure that you're mentioning the hubris, make sure you're mentioning peripeteia, make sure you're mentioning the character arcs and the hamartia. All of those things are what's going to signal to the examiner that you know exactly what you're talking about. So if you're ever in a situation where you have a text that has a set structure, make sure that you learn the set structure. Otherwise, you're really not going to get anywhere with your analysis. Motifs are also commonly used, especially like reoccurring motifs. If any of you have ever read Women at Point Zero, for example, relies heavily on motifs. They're used to emphasize a cycle within your novels, most likely something that's very important to the narrator or a very important theme that the author is really trying to push across. So you need to make sure that you're mentioning why that theme is important or why that message is important. Next, we're moving on to dialogue. Dialogue is something that I feel like not a lot of students think about mentioning, but it's also something that's really important. So why has the author chosen to have a dialogue right there within your book? Or why is that dialogue particularly important in the play? Or something that you can consider is who holds the power within your dialogue? So who's speaking for the longest? Who uses the more powerful language? And that's interesting because you're able to analyze character relationships and the way in which characters interact within a novel or a play and how that constructs an overall story. Then you've got your different types of narratives. So how do the different types of narratives that your novel uses interfere with the way that readers are presented a story or interpret a story? So when you have a first-person narrative, it usually allows for a connection between the reader and the protagonist, making them like the most important part of your story. When you have a third person narrating, then you usually get a more objective story being told, and you also get to find out things that the protagonist doesn't particularly know. So how does that affect the story that you're reading? That's also something that you can pick up on. And last but not least, you've got your use of slang or more colloquial language. So how does that make the story different? Does it impact the way in which a modern audience see it? Does it impact the way in which an older audience would respond to the text. That's also something that you can consider, the different type of audiences which the text is being presented to. This is particularly good if you're ever given a play, especially like Shakespearean plays. So you could talk about how the different types of scenes could be interpreted in a way by a contemporary audience versus an audience of the time, and how that might influence the themes and lessons that we learn from the play in particular. Okay, so now we're going to move on to analyzing poetry. So within poetry, everything that I've kind of mentioned so far are particularly important, and they of course appear time and time again within poems, but there are also some features that are particular to poetry, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So first things first, you have your repetition and your anaphora. So the word that's being emphasized, or the idea that's being repeated, is obviously used for emphasis. So your author wants you to pick up on that. So what is the effect of that on the reader? What does that portray within the poetry? Is it related to a theme? Is it related to a lesson that the poet might want the reader to pick up on? Again, completely subjective to the piece of work that you're analyzing. Next we have juxtaposition and oxymorons. They are used to emphasize a contrast, and again, this is where it's important for you to pick up on your connotations of words. It's overall important to just pick up on connotations of words. It is my particular favorite part of analyzing a piece of text, but I feel like it's particularly important in some techniques, and this is one of them. Pick up on the words that are most contrasted. So which parts of the oxymoron or which parts of the text really create the juxtaposition. Enjambments usually pick up the pace of the poem because the lines continue to flow. Caesuras are usually used to decrease your pace or to emphasize a particular idea, to put an end, a full stop. Sometimes when you're talking about things like death or like love, where there's a definitive end, they might be used to mimic that. And you can also talk about that. Alliteration is one that's particularly used in poems, and one of my favorite things to analyze because I think it's so interesting. But you got things like sibilants, plosives, and fricatives. Your sibilants is completely subjective to the poem that you're reading. For example, within Wilfred Owen's Exposure, you get the S sound mimicking wind, or in Caroline Duffy's Medusa, you get the S sound to mimic your snakes. So most of the time what the sibilance is aiming to do is to imitate a sound that we have in real life in order to build an image in the reader's head, and it is of course your job to understand and pick apart the image that is being built. Your plosives are usually used to create this aggressive or violent tone, and then your fricatives are usually used to decrease the pace of your poem, to almost create this peaceful atmosphere. Now your construction of your poem is completely particular to poetry, so you need to make sure that you are familiar with everything that I'm about to mention. So the first thing that you should consider is your form, particularly in modern poetry, because form in older poetry tends to be ballads or sonnets, and it's simply because that was the type of poetry that they wrote back then. But now that we have the literary freedom, I guess, to pick the type of forms that we want to write our poems on, it can be particularly helpful in picking out hidden meanings. Most of the time when you have a poem that's written in an actual structure in modern times, so like if you have a sonnet or like a ballad, it's most of the time usually used to emphasize there's some sort of restriction or some sort of rigidness in the poem that you're reading, while free verse is usually used to emphasize freedom and sort of this flow of things. But within free verse you can always pick up on the number of stanzas, the lengths of the lines, are they all the same, are some short, are some long, and why that is. So there's literally so many things you could say about the form of a poem. Then you've got your rhyming schemes and your internal rhyme. Now here's the thing, rhyming schemes and your internal rhyme are hard points to develop on their own, so I wouldn't recommend, especially in a timed essay, to use that as a leading point, simply because of the fact that it's hard to develop. However, if you do feel the need to do that, or if you found a really important point that you need to emphasize through the rhyming scheme, then by all means talk about it. But I feel like it is much better to use it in order to emphasize something that you're saying. So for example, if you're analyzing the connotation of a specific word, then you can say that the rhyming scheme emphasizes that word, and that's why that connotation is so important. That's a great point to add, and it's a really easy way to add in your rhyming scheme, but it's also not leaving any room for your analysis of the rhyming scheme to be undeveloped, which is quite often what happens when students just simply mention the rhyming scheme is A, B, A, B, and then that's it. Then you've got your syllables. This is particularly useful when you're analyzing sonnets because, you know, of the meter and the iambic pentameter. And this is again, just like the rhyme, a little bit harder to pick up on and a little bit harder to lead a point with. So I would recommend using the amount of syllables or the meter as an additional point to go along with your analysis. So it emphasizes a specific word that you already analyzed, or emphasizes a specific theme that you already picked up on. These last two ones are almost like additions to your analysis rather than a full main point. Okay, so I really hope that this video helped. If you have any questions, then just go to the contact section here on StudySmart, and then you can just ask your questions through there. But yeah, thank you so much for watching.